400 anti-LGBTQ plus bills nationwide this year alone, many of which specifically target the transgender and gender non-conforming community. To discuss Ohio's current legislation targeting the TGNC community, in addition to sharing stories of trans joy and resilience, we have with us Sean McCann, policy strategist at the ACLU of Ohio, James Knapp, chairman for Trans Ohio, Dr. Ria Debussy, director of external affairs at Equitas Health and Trans Spotlight storyteller, Ice Matamela, Trans Spotlight storyteller, and Cole Finley Nelson, student at the University of Cincinnati and trans activist. Now, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sean for an overview of Ohio's current anti-trans legislation. Sean, what can you tell us about the bills introduced this year?
Oh, that is the question, Micah. That is the question. I will be very brief so that we can focus on why we're here tonight, which is as Micah said, the stories of trans joy and resilience. But just to sort of set the stage, and many of you, I think, probably already know about these bills. We've got a few bills in the current General Assembly, the 135th General Assembly of the Ohio Legislature, that specifically seek to target trans folks, restrict their right to play sports, restrict gender affirming care, kind of impose new requirements on schools that would potentially out children, and sort of all in the name of parents' rights. So the first bill we have is House Bill 6, which is the ban on trans girls and women from playing women's high school and collegiate sports. It's received 2 hearings so far. The first being the sponsor hearing, where the main sponsor of the bill, Representative Jenna Powell, presented her testimony, kind of purporting why she thinks this is important, and then a proponent hearing. Tomorrow morning, we will have an opponent hearing on the bill, where none other than Michael will testify on our behalf, and we'll also have testimony from, the organizations represented tonight and other queer advocacy organizations like Equality Ohio and many others from around the state, many other advocates for trans girls and women from around the state. So that will be really important to get our, to get our narrative out about why this is so harmful. We also have House Bill 68, which is the ban on gender affirming care for minors. That bill is unfortunately also receiving a hearing tomorrow morning, its first hearing. So the sponsor of the bill will get his opportunity to, again, kind of present why he believes that House Bill 68 is. It's hard to put yourselves in the minds of the proponents of these bills, but that will be his opportunity to present his bill. And then the third piece of legislation that we're kind of keeping an eye on is House Bill 8, which is also known by the sponsors of the bill as the Parents' Bill of Rights. This bill would allow parents to opt their child out of certain curriculum if they find it to be, quote unquote, sexually explicit. And it would also require school staff to inform parents about certain changes in their child's well-being, which, the fear being that could be interpreted as if their child is confiding in a counselor, different school staff member, and that school staff member fears that the child might be at risk at home. This bill would put that counselor, that school staff member, in a very difficult position. So that is kind of just quick overview. That those are the 3 bills that we're really the most concerned with. And then we're also watching the state operating budget bill, House Bill 33. There's always an opportunity for legislators to try to advance, a policy like one of these, or a different anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans policy, kind of, in secret in this bill, which is going to get signed into law by the governor by June 30th, which contains, thousands upon thousands of pages. So it's an opportunity for legislators to try to sneak in an unpopular policy, sort of, in the back rooms, so to speak, where the public can't be expected to track all of the different provisions of this bill. So we are remaining vigilant, watching for anything that might pop up in the budget bill, in addition to those 3 that I mentioned. And I think that's about it, Mike. I'll turn it back to you, unless there's anything else that I should touch on briefly.
That's great. Thank you so much for the overview, Sean. Really appreciate it. As we can tell, and most of us already know from that, it is a really, really tough time for trans youth in particular, but trans people and their families in Ohio. James, what else should folks be aware of as it relates to this legislation and trans rights generally in Ohio?
I think it's important that folks recognize that what's happening in Ohio is a concentrated effort that's happening in other states too. And just this year, there have been 400 plus anti-trans bills introduced across the nation, and it's only 4 months in. So this isn't something that's happening organically in Ohio. It's part of a concentrated effort that's been in the works now for a while. I shared some maps with the ACLU of Ohio, which hopefully they can put up on the screen for us a little later. But just, so we're all aware, there are guidelines already in place for transgender participation in school sports. And in many cases, those policies have been in place in decades, if not longer. Only a handful of states before 2020 forbid transgender participation in school sports, and most states already allowed it. There's only a handful of states now that don't have policies on participation at all. Ohio is one of many states that has had a policy on trans participation in sports, but that participation policy isn't great. Trans girls and women, in order to participate in school sports consistent with their gender identity, they have to wait a whole year after starting either hormone replacement therapy or hormonal suppression therapy. And after that, they have to get a waiver from their athletic director in every single sport, every single season. And that waiver has to include medical documentation of their hormone suppression. That's not a perfect policy. But under the bill that's pending right now, even that policy would be too much, and trans girls and women wouldn't be able to participate at all. So this talk that trans girls and women are just sweeping competitions, it's just false. And it's so easy to prove that hasn't been happening. Transgender athletes have been able to participate at the Olympic level for a decade now. There hasn't been a single athletic or medal that was given to a single trans athlete. We have a non-binary athlete who had won as a team medal, but in over a decade, trans women and girls haven't been able to compete at a level that Ohio is now saying that its middle schoolers and high school have to compete at that same level. In order, it's absurd to me. But it's worth noting that Ohio is following trends here. And the trends following other states, the states that have banned trans athletes from participating in schools this year has grown exponentially from last year. There are 3 different states now that are facing lawsuits in federal courts against this because it violates students' existing rights, not just under the policies that already existed, but under Title IX. And, I don't want to get into that because there's a new guidance under Title IX that the rules already open. Y'all should comment on it. It closes on May 15th, which is my birthday. So for me, please make a comment on that guidance that, we need to protect our trans students and not set them up for tests that set them apart from their cisgender counterparts, because schools already have policies that exist and they have been working. All right. The same is true for states that have been banning gender affirming care. In Ohio, there were only 4 hospital systems that have used specific centers for trans patients. So this idea that trans youth are walking into any hospital and walking out with sex changes without their parental consent isn't just like the stuff of nightmares. It's just impossible on every possible fronts. It's hard enough for trans kids to access gender affirming care as it is, and Ohio is attempting to make it harder. Every single medical association, major medical association in the US and worldwide, recognizes that gender affirming care for trans people is medically necessary. So House Bill 68 that would ban gender affirming care for all trans kids living in Ohio, even if they're seeking care out of state. Not only is that against medical guidance and against best practices, but it's unconstitutional on two different fronts. We can't be telling patients that they can't seek care out of state. We can't be telling doctors that they cannot talk to their colleagues and not give them referrals in their own hospital systems, working on their own teams, because Ohio has this bill that you can't treat trans youth. And by the way, these bills attacking trans youth aimed at allegedly protecting minors from surgeries do nothing to protect intersex youth, including infants, from forced non-consensual surgeries on their genitals. So this clearly has nothing to do with surgeries. It has everything to do with attacking a minority population, which right now is the trans community. But in context, I wanted to give an update on the birth certificate case at Adelaide. While all this has been going on, trans people under some of these school policies have to have their birth certificate updated or corrected in order to participate in school sports. Several states are trying to make it impossible for trans students to update their birth certificates so they wouldn't be able to play. Several of these policies are about athletes are saying that transgender students have to have a certain medical intervention. Several of these states, including Ohio, are making those interventions impossible. So all of these bills are related. And as a back note, Ohio has treated transgender patients for decades. This is a new thing. So when we hear from people who are anti-trans that transgenderism is new, what's actually new is this level of transphobia. Because trans patients have been able to access care, not just in Ohio, but across the nation. It's always been difficult. It has never been this level of impossible, where we're facing state laws. But under the Ray case, which was an ACLU case, we got the decision from the courts that the Ohio Department of Health's refusal to accept any applications from transgender or non-binary applicants, just refusal to process it because they were trans. That was illegal. It was unconstitutional. They had to change their policy. ODH changed their policy to, all right, get a probate court order. You think that would be easy, especially because the Supreme Court of Ohio issued its own model for the probate courts. In the Adelaide case, there was a trans woman who was born in Clark County, who lived in Clark County, and she filled out all the paperwork she had to fill out, went to court, and was told by the judge that he didn't have the statutory authority to grant the relief requested. And even if he wanted to, he couldn't give her a new birth certificate. By the way, he didn't think that she needed one anyway because she was born a boy. So it was not a great decision. But the issue really was the probate judge said he didn't have the authority to follow the law. And ODH required that the probate court give an order before the birth certificate be updated. So anyone born in Clark County either has to move, declare residency elsewhere, or just not update their birth certificate. The Supreme Court of Ohio picked up the case after the circuit court decided that it agreed with the probate court and actually stated in the opinion that it wasn't going to decide on some legal issues, which was interesting. Because the legal issue here really is a statutory interpretation issue, really not a gender issue. But in October of 2022, the Supreme Court of Ohio accepted jurisdiction of this case. So the issue at the case wasn't, gender. It was whether or not the probate courts had the authority to not grant this request at all. In April of 2023, almost a full year later, the Supreme Court of Ohio heard oral arguments where the Supreme Court justices questioned whether or not this court had jurisdiction, even though it accepted jurisdiction, pointing out that there was no opposite party. There was no one on the other side. But it's worth noting that at no point did the Ohio Department of Health step in and file anything on the case. They never once responded. And the lower court, Clark County, the probate court, never responded either. So the issue is really a complicated one because it shouldn't be this complicated, y'all. And I do say this as a trans attorney, so I understand the legal issues, but also as a trans person myself, it should not be this difficult. And I went through this process myself in the early 2000s. It was difficult then, it wasn't impossible. You know, and we are fighting the same fights I was fighting as a youth. So it absolutely breaks my heart that we are fighting the same fights now. But, you know, people are doing everything they are required to do under the policies, under the law, and they're still being denied. That's discrimination. There's no other word for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your vulnerability and all of that context, James. It's clear that, you know, there's an attack on freedoms and civil liberties for trans people on all fronts right now. Ria, can you tell us why lived and legal equality is important for the trans community?
Yeah, definitely. I'm also gonna keep an eye on the time just to make sure I don't run over, because I'm Southern and I'm an extrovert and I will talk people's ear off about this topic if not. So just really quick, just because I don't want to assume like folks know the difference between those terms. Just really quick, like if we're thinking about like lived and legal equality is basically like the equality that you're getting from various like laws, right? So it's things like, you know, having like a non-discrimination ordinance, having like a law that enforces like equal pay, these types of things, right? Fun fact, Ohio does not have an LGBTQ plus inclusive non-discrimination law. There are lots of cities and some towns and even villages across the state that do have that at the local level, but there's literally nothing at the statewide level here in Ohio to protect queer and trans folks. So, you know, the legal equality piece is basically that we have a law that's theoretically supposed to protect us and theoretically supposed to provide for the same outcomes as cisgender and straight folks, right? So when we're talking about lived equality is something different. I generally think of lived equality as being something that's like a much higher threshold, right? Because like you can have a law that says like your employer can't discriminate against you, right? But you can still have an employer that discriminates against you. Like we know that this happens and there are thousands upon thousands of cases of employment discrimination that get reported to the federal government every year, right? But lived equality is basically making sure that folks actually have the same like sort of equal experience in their day-to-day lives, regardless of what the law actually says, right? So basically making sure that in this instance, that trans folks are free from discrimination and the impact of discrimination, including microaggressions like misgendering, dead naming, et cetera, right? Lived equality would also be making sure that trans, non-binary, and gender expansive folks also have access to the healthcare resources they need for equal outcomes so that we have actual equitable healthcare resources. So gender expansive folks don't have to face health disparities, making sure that another example of lived equality would be making sure that regardless of what the law says, trans folks are paid an equitable wage and paid a fair wage for the work that they do. And we know that that very much does not happen, particularly when we're talking about trans folks of color and particularly trans feminine folks of color. And so another sort of example of lived equality would be making sure that trans folks don't have any experiences with housing disparities, that they're able to access fair, affordable, stable, and frankly, nice housing, right? And basically, like overall, what we're talking about with like this difference between lived and legal equality is again, focusing on those laws to ensure that the same legal protections exist for all members of a society, right? But lived equality is again, like that kind of higher threshold of making sure that frankly, and like to go on theme with like the like title for this event, right? That we're not having stuff that's stealing people's joy, right? And certainly like we're a very self-selected audience of folks who've come to learn about this topic today, right? But you know, we know that there are lots of ways in which particularly politicians in the state of Ohio, but also around the country are trying to steal joy from trans, non-binary, and gender expansive folks. And the most obvious method is, you know, just the alarming rate at which they're bullying trans kids and getting away with it, right? But that's basically kind of the short version of the difference between lived and legal equality. Try to toss in a few examples there if you want to bring some of that knowledge and take it and educate folks outside of this space too.
Thank you so much. That was a great explanation, Ria. These attacks on trans rights, this fear-mongering, is based on misconceptions and false narratives. Supporters of these bills have turned to fear-mongering rather than facts when it comes to justifying this type of oppressive legislation and passing bills, sports bans, gender-affirming care bans. Many of the misconceptions do revolve around gender-affirming care. Ice, can you tell us what gender-affirming care is and how has receiving this care shaped your life?
Yes, thank you, Micah. It's hard to say what does it look like to someone without sitting there saying like, what do any human being want? Do we want to be healthy? Do we want to be happy? Do we want to be able to live life and not worry about danger around the corner? That's basic moments right there. And in that access, just saying this, I'm 40 years old, and at the age of 15, I played football, and I didn't get to play football based off of them just letting me walk on the field. Born female, they did give me every resistance all the way through it. We're talking about the 90s. Am I surprised we're still going through it? I'm not gonna say I'm not. There's no surprise in this. What it is just now how much people are going out of their way to just be outrageous. I'm trying to figure out where does anybody's opinion dictates how I should have my body. And as long as I'm not hurting anybody else, what does that have to do with me? Not having my mother's support when it comes to medical and being queer, that would have been an absolute devastation in my life. I know I've had friends who committed suicide because of the fact that they did not have that support. And that's mental health. Those are key things that start at the beginning. Having somebody determine before I mentally am aware of myself, my gender is outrageous. You can't tell me my personality. You can't tell me the things that I like and I don't like. I love spinach. I know a lot of people who don't. It doesn't mean that it's a wrong thing or a right thing. It's just a thing. It is my thing. It is a part of what I am because I love spinach. So what does it have to do with anybody else? I want to make sure I don't take too much time as well, but healthcare is just basic. I find it funny how people want to say, oh, I don't want you to tell me what vaccinations I have to take or I have to give my children. But then you turn around and tell me, well, when it comes to your child, I'm not going to allow you to make the decision of of them being able to have mental health, to support them in being the best human that they can be in life, in the safe zone. And that is the problem that we are really going to have the biggest hit at, is support system. If you take that shelter away, that has actually developed over the years, because I didn't have these safe zones. I didn't have it. I didn't have anybody to talk to. I had to bump into people and look at them and see that they might be like me, to be able to talk to them and have a conversation. And growing up in Wisconsin, that wasn't available around the corner. So for now, be in this atmosphere where we do have the support, there is the knowledge. Why are we having the conversation? We're supposed to be a further along intelligent species, but yet we're acting as if we're going backwards. Like, I'm confused right now. Like, how is my health impact somebody else? As long as it doesn't hurt them physically, mentally, I don't see how. But that is healthcare. That is healthcare. If I have the most money, I can be able to do what I need to do. If I go overseas, I could have my surgery right now, today, and not have to think twice about it. And here, where I was born, in the country, in the land of the free, I'm having to fight to be me. And that's healthcare that is a necessity. And I love my country, and even having this platform to even have this conversation is amazing. But let's keep having the conversation. But instead of just having the conversation, what are we going to do to change this? And what is it in the mindset that's allowing this barricade that is continuing to try to pop up to stop us as advancing as who we are? I apologize if I went over my time, but Micah, I hope I answered your question.
No need to apologize. Thank you so much for sharing. I love that you brought up support. I love that your mom is supportive for you. I think it's super important that you brought that up, because support, as we know, as trans people, is critically important for us in our growth and our ability to survive and thrive. We know that these bills are attacking civil liberties, not just with gender affirming care, but also in school and sports. And these attacks really undermine the importance of support, safety, and inclusive spaces for TGNC youth to grow and learn. Cole Finley, were there any mentors, teachers, or coaches who made you feel safe and affirmed while growing up, and how did they change your life?
I think that to answer this question, for me personally, I have to first explain how I didn't have that growing up before, to really understand the weight of what the mentors I have now mean to me. Growing up, I was raised in a conservative Catholic family where my dad was a ranking officer in the Marine Corps. And while I don't like to give into stereotypes and assumptions, what you imagine when I say the words conservative, Catholic, and Marine are probably still a gentler image than what it actually was like. Additionally, my siblings and I were homeschooled to keep us away from the influence of the devil and all of those liberal views of teachers and peer students. Suffice to say, my experience of mentorship or support did not begin in childhood. So much of my childhood would have been different if there had been supportive adults in my life. Last year, I moved to Cincinnati and have since, for the first time, found a community of people who support me and are looking to see me thrive. I never thought I would be involved in another Christian circle, but I am now the president of a Christian community house that is based off of a club here at UC. And one of my best friends is a fierce woman who is not afraid to say when something is wrong or stand up for those who are marginalized. She also happens to be an Episcopal priest. Her name is Alice Connor, and there is so much I have learned and begun to believe because of her patience, support, and love. Through examples and very long conversations, I have begun to learn to trust people around me, which has led to me being able to feel seen. And man, oh man, what a feeling that is. To be seen for what feels like the first time by people you trust and who you want to see you. Having the support growing up would have had the potential to reduce my reluctance to ask for help now, and the sense of isolation that eventually led to me turning to self-harm and suicide attempts. I would have had a higher likelihood of not falling into abusive relationships because I would know what love truly should look like and feel like. Feeling like you belong somewhere is a very powerful thing. You cannot reach out to grow without a stable support you know you can turn back and lean on. Going back to Alice a little bit, she has this catchphrase of feel your feelings, which was a foreign concept to me for sure when I first moved here, but something I've really learned to value and leaned into at this point. Alice was the first person I opened up to about my past traumas and fears that follow me in everyday life. She is who allowed me a sense of safety and hope for the first time. And that's something that I have witnessed firsthand. I have worked as a crisis counselor online for specifically LGBTQ youth. And one of the biggest things that they come to us for is the fact that they don't have support. And we are their support in those times when there should be parental or other adult figures in their lives supporting them. So I didn't have it growing up, and I wish that I had. And I really hope and want to be that for other trans youth now because of how important it is psychologically, but also just in life, just how they exist. So.
That was a beautiful answer. Thank you so much, Cole Finley. I love that Reverend Alice is in your corner now. And speaking of Reverend Alice, who will be there tomorrow morning for the House Bill 6 opponent testimony, we're going to switch gears a little bit towards sports inclusivity. Ria, can you tell us why sports inclusivity is so important for Trans Ohioans, and what are some common misconceptions that we hear?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, like, it's important because like every kid and every person, regardless of their gender identity, should be able to play school sports, right? School sports are supposed to be about fun. They're supposed to be about enriching like the educational and social development of our kiddos, right? And our young adults. It's not supposed to be something that is supposed to discriminate against people. And it's not something that we should exclude people from, right? Like, simple as that. So in terms of misconceptions that folks have specifically about trans folks in sport, I could go through an entire laundry list, right? Like, there are plenty. As many people know, I, for a couple years, did some things with the NCAA and then publicly stepped back from that because of their nonsense in terms of restricting access for trans folks to compete. And so, you know, three of kind of the most common misconceptions that I have encountered are, first one being that trans women have some type of unfair advantage and shouldn't compete on women's teams. And the logic there being like, it's really just about fairness. I'll talk about why that's a misconception here in a minute, or like not accurate here in a minute. Another misconception that I've come across a lot is, you know, this idea that letting trans folks compete on teams that align with their gender identities will ultimately harm women's sports. A lot of these like anti-trans sports bills are called like Save Women's Sports Act. And I have never seen a group of men so interested in women's sports as some of the folks that are arguing for these bills. And ultimately, it's because it's not about saving women's sports. It's not even about caring about women's sports. It's about harming trans people, right? And using that misconception to do so. And then the last one that I encounter a lot is this idea that like we're protecting kids by keeping trans people out of sports, which is just like completely erroneous as well. So circling back to that first one of this like myth that like trans women have this like unfair advantage, basically like statements like this really just appeal to folks that, or try to appeal to folks that don't have a strong understanding of the science behind basically trans health, but also just like sports science, right? These types of statements like have really, really problematic legacies that have their roots really in like, obviously sexism and misogyny and transphobia, but also that intersect very much with like the legacies of like scientific racism, xenophobia, and pseudosciences like phrenology, or like the measuring of like various body parts, specifically like skulls, right? And like we have decades of scientific evidence that show us that trans women and trans feminine people who undergo hormone replacement therapy and suppress their testosterone to levels at, or in the instance of many of these sports regulations, like even below the levels that are allowed for cisgender women, lose significant levels of muscle mass, endurance, and sometimes even height. Fun fact, I lost over an inch and legally had to change my height like 2 years into my transition. And this is stuff that is like a very common experience for trans feminine people. But basically, like these myths are playing on these misconceptions and lack of understanding of like the actual science of trans health, right? The other myth that I talked about of this idea that like, this is something that harms women's sports, that's not true, right? Like statements like that basically hide behind this like false sense of concern for women's rights, and also like women's sports and sports equity, right? They're prioritizing transphobia, and really like when we think about it, like forcing trans folks to compete on teams that align with their sex assigned at birth also actively harms cisgender women, right? So like when we think about the fact that like it forces like trans men and trans masculine people to misgender themselves, but to then compete on women's teams, right? If the logic is that like testosterone is some like miracle drug that makes you like this like sports god, right? Then it wouldn't make sense that we're forcing trans men who might then be taking T in many instances, as in like the instance of like Mac Beggs, who is this trans wrestler in Texas, who was forced to do this, right? Forced to compete on women's teams and then won and like dominated, right? All of these titles, right? Because he was being forced to not play on the team that aligned with his gender identity. So like if we're like presuming that T is like some like miracle drug, right? Then why are we forcing trans mask folks to compete on women's teams if we care about women's sports? And so it's like, I kind of think of like that gif of Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob where everything starts spinning really quick because none of it makes sense, right? And then the last one basically, and there's still like a whole other kettle of worms. We talk about like gender policing and like accusing folks. There's a whole like layer of like the way this impacts intersex people too. But I'm trying to like keep it on time, and my little timer already says I'm a minute over. But the last one of like we're protecting children by keeping trans folks out of sports. That's just building on this like false narrative that like trans folks harm children, and it like really plays into a lot of historical presumptions, and we know none of that is true, right? Like absolutely none of that's true. So yeah, lots of ways in which like these specific bans cause a lot of harm too.
Thank you so much for that, Ria. It's clear that, the sports ban, the gender affirming care ban, these are all fueled by false social narratives. And these harmful social narratives really reduce us to our medical interventions or our body parts or our hormones. It really fixates on our trans identity, which is only one part of the expanse humans that we are and who we are as people. Ice, who are you and what brings you joy? Let's go to some more hopeful things.
Okay, absolutely. Because I definitely wanted to touch bases on the fact that Ria did bring up sports. I love sports. I've been playing them all my life. From hockey to football, basketball. I ran track, cross country. I've been told every different which way I shouldn't have played all those sports, and encouraged to play basketball because I'm Black. Like, it doesn't matter. I love sports, and I will still to this day go to a sporting event, and especially when you've got great food. Like, love to eat. I hope that we do get to the point where we stop hindering kids to be kids. That was the best time of my life when I could walk on a field, and even though it was outside of school time, I could play, and the guys were excited to pick me because they knew I could play. So, you know, I'm ready for that. I'm happy that kids are getting excited about being in sports again, because that's the only reason why this is even a conversation. If trans kids didn't start feeling comfortable in their body to be able to want to walk on these fields or on the ice, so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about sports. I'm hopeful in that we can do what we need to do to allow them to be kids. I think that's a great thing. So I love food. That's who I am. I love to eat. You met me at a Puerto Rican festival, so you already know, like hands down. I'm always down for a good meal. And just family and friends. And family is not determined by blood. It's determined by who cares about you and encourages you to be the best to you. So those are the things that I enjoy and who I am.
Thank you so much, Ice. I love that you bring up sports because, like you said, in all of this conversation about fairness and different people joining different leagues, we often forget that for kids, this is about teamwork and camaraderie and feeling belonging within your peers. And I'm glad to hear that it brought you so much joy. Cole Finley, what
Thanks.
about you? Who are you and what brings you joy?
As stated before, my name is Cole Finley. I am a 22-year-old transmasculine individual, a current undergraduate student at the University of Cincinnati, and I am majoring in psychology. I've been actively fighting back against anti-LGBTQ youth legislation for the past 4 years and working with LGBTQ youth in crisis for the past 5 years. I aspire to go into the field of psychology, working in crisis management for youth and adolescents, specifically those in marginalized communities, such as the LGBTQ community. Prior to moving to Cincinnati, I was living in Mississippi, and I worked as the executive assistant for the Trans program, which is Mississippi's only trans-specific organization. Just this spring, I actually flew down there after helping to organize a protest against their House Bill 1125, which was another terrible anti-trans bill that unfortunately got passed. But seeing the community come together for the trans youth was inspiring. This is a community who had active threats of danger declared to try to keep us from getting our voices to be heard, and we still showed up. We chanted and sang, we gave testimony and speeches. We stood in community and showed the youth of Mississippi that they are not alone, and we will continue to fight for them, regardless of threats. This was joy and resilience. I'm now working to get more involved in Ohio-based organizations that are fighting back against systemic hate, such as Equality Ohio, the ACLU, and Trans Ohio, of course. I have been sending a call to action to every group and organization I am part of here at UC by having planned and led testimony writing workshops and compiling easier to understand descriptions of what these bills are trying to pass, because I have found that that is the most complicated aspect of this for most people, is they're not understanding what the bills are doing. Though there are many things I could focus my energy and time on lamenting over, there continue to be things worth celebrating and the joy that they provide. For me, I feel this when I'm surrounded by my friends who I know support me as I am, when I hear their vibrant laughter or witness their open sharing of their personal stories, or even when we sit together in grief. Community is not something I grew up knowing the meaning or weight of, but has been something I have found and am learning to lean into this past year. The joy found in these members of my community supporting one another is beautiful. Joy is found in hearing professional Christians, such as priests and pastors, talk about acceptance and arguing with other professional Christians against the past sins of the church and how change is necessary. My joy is also felt in nature, in the texture of tree bark as I hike through the woods, the softness of moss and leaves, the cool movement of water. Nature has a resonance that provides a calm joy in witnessing all the beauty of it. But more specifically, I find joy in getting to be the support for trans youth that they so desperately need and who I wish I had growing up. Since finding safety and support in my community here, I have been able to recognize the fact that joy exists all around us, even in the worst of times.
Thank you so much, Cole Finley. We're so grateful to have you in Ohio and fighting alongside us in this movement. It's really great to have you here.
I'm happy
Trans,
to be.
Great, thank you. Trans joy, resiliency, hope, and lives obviously are here to stay. But now more than ever, in the face of these legislative attacks, we need our community to step up for us. Ria, what are some steps that your neighbors can take today to support the trans community and the gender nonconforming community?
Yeah, in terms of like supporting like trans, non-binary, and gender expansive folks, like there are a number of things like people can do. Most of my advice is going to center upon what cisgender people can do specifically. So the first one, like here in Ohio, right, as with like all across the country, trans, non-binary, gender expansive, as well as intersex organizations receive a mere fraction of the funds that broader LGBTQ plus organizations receive. So one thing I would really urge folks to do is like identify a trans, non-binary, gender expansive, and or intersex organization that you can support. If you're looking for like one in Ohio, we actually have a lot of like smaller trans orgs. I'm not going to mention like all of them, but I'll mention 3 that are really like near and dear to my heart. And I will also drop the donate links into the chat for you here in a second to make it as easy as possible if you have the funds available to donate. Not everyone does, and that is perfectly okay. There are other tips I'll give you in a second. So the first one is for Trans Ohio. Trans Ohio is the founding partner for the Ohio Name Change Clinic, which actively helps trans folks with accessing free name and or gender marker changes. And they also provide scholarships for folks who need financial assistance to change a name and or gender marker legally. It gets very expensive. I quit counting the cost that mine was taking when it got to like 500 because it got real depressing real fast. So you could donate to Trans Ohio. You could donate to the Trans Advocacy Council or TAC down in the greater Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky area. Kentucky trans folks are also going through it right now, right? But TAC has an emergency fund that folks living in the area that they serve can help with basically like anything they need, even if it's just like bills or food, et cetera, right? Like day-to-day needs. So TAC is another great organization to support. And the other one I would say, and again, there are lots of others. I'm only like spending time on 3 because like there's not enough time for me to like go through all of them. Margie's Hope is a good one. Margie's Hope has a ton of different programs, including Margie's Cupboard, which is basically a food assistance program for folks who are food insecure in the Akron area. So Margie's Hope is another really great program. They also do a ton of other stuff beyond just like the Cupboard program. And I'll drop a link in the chat here in a moment so you can kind of like look and pick which one you might want to help out if you have the financial means to do so, right? The other thing that like everyone can do, regardless of your financial ability, to toss a few dollars to a trans org would be to specifically just like ask trans folks in your life like what they need from you, right? Like I have very rarely had that happen. And there have been some times where I wish folks would have asked instead of just like presuming, whether it was presuming like I didn't need anything and I was cool and good, or whether it was presuming I needed something that I didn't really need, right? So I think that like that's also super helpful is like literally take a moment to like ask trans folks in your life like what they need. And the last piece of advice I would have is, you know, don't expect trans, non-binary, and gender expansive folks to like cater to your feelings, right? Like especially if you're doing something that like a trans, non-binary, or gender expansive person like corrects, right? Of like, hey, this like isn't really like the best like idea, like center their voices, right? Like they're people who are being affected by these things. And we're kind of, well, not kind of, we are in very much unprecedented times right now with the ways in which the rights of gender expansive folks are being attacked, right? So if a trans person tells you like, hey, like knock that out, like don't say something like that, don't show up as an ally in like this specific way, or you're taking up too much space or something like that, right? You know, don't focus on like your feelings being hurt by receiving feedback from a trans person, rather, because that's ultimately centering yourself and your experience rather than the experience of trans folks, right? Instead, really like center the experience of what trans folks need and specifically what feedback you've been given and take that into account, because that type of stuff that trans folks are asking you or telling you to do, right? That's going to be stuff that you can actively do as a cis person to help with supporting trans joy, right? And so, you know, really like the short version of that, like TLDR version is basically like, listen to trans folks. And if a trans person tells you like, hey, do this differently, that's not really the best way to show up as an ally, don't be upset by that. Rather, I would say honestly, be thankful, right? Because if someone's telling you that, the same as like me as a white person, right? If one of my friends of color is telling me like something like, hey, Ria, like you're showing up in like a not great way, like that person is telling me because they still want to have that relationship with me. They still want to maintain that relationship with me. They care enough about our connection to each other to basically make sure that they're communicating that feedback to me. So I should really be thankful for that at the end of the day. So basically kind of like reframing it in that way. Sorry, I took too much time.
No apologies necessary. That was perfect. Thank you. James, what are some ways, in your opinion, that the community can step up and help the trans community now?
You know, I think Rhea made some excellent points. You know, the number one way people can give back to the trans community is to give directly to trans community members, whether that's direct funds like cash money or gift certificates, buying people lunch, taking people out to dinner, and just seeing what trans people need. Because a lot of folks are going through depression right now. We need people to come over and help us organize the cupboards, help us do the dishes, help us make difficult phone conversations, help us sort out ideas, you know, help us do our taxes. Y'all, that was due. Anyway, you know, there's many ways that you can show up in people's lives to give directly. That doesn't involve money contributions. Also donate to trans-led orgs. And if you don't know any trans-led orgs, you do now. Also donate to ally groups who are doing the work. Contact your legislatures, contact your local school boards, have the difficult conversations. Don't leave it up to trans and non-binary people to always be the ones correcting people when there's such misinformation floating out there in the metaverse and on the internet. When you are having conversations with people, always act like there is a trans person within earshot, because there could be, y'all. And if you are allies, you will always show up even if there aren't trans people in the room with you. You know, shut down transphobia whenever you see it, however you see it. Show up when you can, where you can. You know, tomorrow there is a demonstration outside the State House because at 9:30 a.m. there are 3 different anti-trans bills. If you can't show up to the State House, you can still send an email to your legislators. You can still share on Facebook, on social media. You can make a call. You can send a care package. You know, show up how you can and always keep learning, because there are going to be ways that you think are good that may not be great. And, you know, regardless of whether you show up in big ways or small ways, we can always improve. So always be open to feedback and criticism. I think also, you know, just to keep sharing the joy, y'all can submit to the Trans Ohio zine, which is our new online magazine committed to trans joy. And ACLU can share the link to that. It's open to anyone who is trans in Ohio. And I welcome you all.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you to every one of our panelists for your vulnerability and openness in talking about really personal things tonight and the issues that our community is facing. We would love to open the chat up to Q&A. So if you have any questions for one of our speakers, please feel free to place it in the chat. I want to go back. There was a comment by Rebecca a little while ago talking about the resistance to trans rights being religious-based and separation of church and state. You know, our government is not a theocracy, but it is very obvious, especially in Ohio, that extremely gerrymandered legislatures enable lawmakers to play to the extremes in their party. Unfortunately, in Ohio, that means that they're going to be pushing a conservative far-right agenda that does aim to ban abortion and LGBTQ protections. And so unfortunately, that is the battle that we're facing. It's why it's so important for everyone to be civically engaged, and a reminder that, you know, gerrymandering impacts everyone and every issue. It's trans rights, it's women's rights, it's everything. So very important for people to be involved. I'll get us kicked off and send a question to either Sean or James. If either of you or both of you want to answer, can you briefly explain what the Ohio Business Competes is, and how anyone listening could advocate for their company to join the growing list of businesses in this coalition?
Sure, that's an Equality Ohio project. It's a coalition of businesses in Ohio that have supported having inclusive policies for their LGBT employees, and have dedicated themselves to promoting and passing the Ohio Fairness Act. There's over 500 some now businesses. If anyone on the call is a small business owner of any size, y'all can still sign up.
Thank you so much, James. Anything to add, Sean? All good? Awesome. Cool. I'll go ahead and pass off a question to Ice, if that's all right. Can you tell us about a time that you were affirmed in your trans identity, whatever that looks like, maybe the first time, and what that meant to you?
Affirmed in it. It's like a catch-22 moment. It's almost as if I would be affirmed in it, and I would have somebody come right back around and bring me back down. You know, I would say when I did start testosterone hormone therapy, coming out of the doctor's office and knowing that my preferred name and pronouns were going to be used, it was definitely like, have somebody official actually look at me. That would probably be the best one, I would say. But yeah, that's a good one right there for me.
I love that. I can relate to that. I think that my care started at Equitas Health, coincidentally, where Ria works, and having a doctor, you know, look at me and say, hey, you know, this is normal. There is treatment for this, was a life-changing thing for me. I totally relate to that. Sean, I'm going to pass one to you. Are there any positive LGBTQ bills that we can look for in this session for the General Assembly?
Yes, great question. And so we do not have an introduced bill yet, or rather reintroduced, because as James mentioned, the Ohio Fairness Act, which the Ohio Business Competes Coalition has organized around, is that very bill that, you know, I think it was Rhea who mentioned earlier that we in the Ohio Revised Code do not have protections for LGBTQ folks, you know, on the basis of housing, employment, and public accommodation. So currently, right now, you know, landlords can deny, can refuse to rent to queer folks, or, you know, in employment, folks can be denied jobs. So the Ohio Fairness Act would just explicitly enshrine in law those protections for LGBTQ folks. We are looking forward to that bill being reintroduced later this year by Senate Minority Leader Nikki Antonio. And I believe she's having conversations with a couple different, with maybe one particular Republican senator who comes at it kind of from the small business owner angle, and is excited to work with her on that bill. So and then over in the House, we've had a couple members work together on that bill in the past, and it seems that they will be reintroducing their version of the bill again. So that's a great one. And then I would love to see other legislators come forward with ideas. I think it'd be even just kind of as a part of the counter narrative to all the anti-trans bills, all the all the anti-LGBTQ bills. I think we'll be curious to see if any other legislators have ideas along those lines.
Thanks, Sean. I'm going to pass one off to Ria. What are some common misconceptions about gender affirming care? We heard about the misconceptions for sports related bills. What are some common misconceptions that Equitas often hears about gender affirming care?
Yeah, I mean, like, our patients are like a little bit more like obviously like self-selecting, right? We're like one of the biggest LGBTQ plus health centers in the country. But when I think kind of more commonly of like misconceptions people have about like gender affirming care, I think it's kind of largely that like a lot of people just like presume they know what it means, right? Like they presume they know what like trans healthcare looks like. And like, I think even like well-meaning like cis allies, right? Like I know when I started like HRT a few years ago, like I also like wanted to do some stuff with my voice, right? And like as a trans feminine person, like generally like if you've gone through puberty with some T in there, like you got to do like some other like vocal therapy or like things like that to like be able to get your voice to like potentially like have like more feminine qualities, right? And like when I was like telling like some like cis folks in my life about like doing like, oh yeah, I'm gonna start like gender affirming vocal therapy soon, folks were like, wait, I thought like don't hormones just like change your voice? And just like did not understand like the experience of like what healthcare looks like or can look like for a trans feminine person, right? Or just a trans person. And so like that was something that I was like, oh wow, like people really don't know. Like, but I think what it goes kind of boils down to, right, is like, I don't know, like, you know, depending on like where you're at in this country is going to depend on like what your sex ed curriculum looks like and how your like understanding of like even like secondary sex characteristics develop. And so, you know, I think that that just like speaks to like a very different kind of thing, right? Of like, you know, folks don't always know what is meant by like the phrase gender affirming care, particularly in relation to like trans folks and like the experience of any variety of like health needs in the broader trans community. And like even a couple of my like close trans mask friends, like I had one of them tell me, it was like a year ago at this point, but they were like, Ria, I have learned so much about trans healthcare, just like watching your transition, because like I knew plenty about like HRT options for like trans mask folks and like nothing about like HRT for trans feminine folks. And it's just one of these things where it's like, okay, well, it's maybe not like the information that applies to you, so you haven't like sought it out, right? And so I think that at the end of the day, like some of the kind of common misconceptions of gender affirming care are wide, like they're wide and varied, right? From like just not knowing really anything to like when we see like to also the very opposite side of the spectrum of like some of these legislators that are like presuming really horrific things, right? And so, you know, I think that there's like kind of a wide variety of different sort of varying knowledge levels. And I think that one of the big things with that too is like also, you know, making sure that, you know, just because you don't have the knowledge of like what a type of healthcare or healthcare option looks like for a trans person doesn't mean you can just pull something out of thin air and like presume that's going to be correct, which is what a lot of these gender affirming care bans also do. They make a lot of presumptions. Yeah, I don't know if that was helpful or not.
That was really great. Thank you. I think it's also important to note that a common misconception for gender affirming care that it's only for trans people. Gender affirming care is for everyone. In fact, the vast majority of people who consume gender affirming care in our society are cisgender people. It's things that make you feel affirmed in your own body, in your own gender identity. So it's for everyone. It's not just, for trans folks. It looks like we have a question from Danielle in the chat, which Cole Finley, I'm going to pass to you. And then whoever else wants to answer this, please feel free to hop in afterwards. Based on your experiences and adult perspective, what do you think about trans kids under 18 speaking out publicly in this climate in Ohio? Parents are supposed to protect their kids and also empower them to express themselves. Sometimes it feels those two values can be in conflict.
I appreciate you passing me this question. This is something that I've had a lot of discussion with a lot of different parents about. The voice of trans youth in these spaces is so valuable, but it can also be dangerous, that's for sure. I think that if a trans youth is supported by their family and has expressed the fact that they want to be an activist, that they want to be a part of this and are okay with their voice being shared, that is supportive to go with them and show up regardless really of the danger of it, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what they are asking for. That's how they want to show up for their community, but also how they want you to show up for their community. They want you to stand there with them and help support them in that way.
Thank you, Cole. I really appreciate what you said about it's not only, how they want you to support them, but also how you want them to support your community. I think that's really important to note. Does anybody else want to hop in and answer that question from their own perspective? Go for it, Ice.
Okay, so absolutely, like, the youth have to be in this fight, because nothing gets done in this country, or any country actually, when it comes to politics and changing minds, unless the young people do it. That's automatic. And if they're not fighting their own fight, they're going to go unheard. So yeah, they have to be in the front, and they have to have everybody's support. And that's allies and old people like myself. I mean, yes, absolutely. Like, we need everybody there, parents, whether they're under 18, over 18, it doesn't matter. Human beings show up. That's it, support our future, because the kids are the ones getting affected. They are our future. And guess what? They're the ones that are going to take care of us. So we need to make sure they have all the tools they need throughout life to be able to be the best people they can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ice. Really appreciate that.
I understand the impulse to try to protect our children, especially in this current political climate, when the rates of depression haven't been higher, but the rates of violence against the trans community also haven't been higher. And they've been raising every single year since 2014, which, by the way, is the year that they've started keeping track. So 2 decades ago, I spoke out against gender affirming, pronoun uses, basically, in my high school. And I did it in front of the school board. It was horrifying, but it was basically me and a few, maybe 4 people in the room and the school board. It wasn't televised. People didn't watch it on YouTube. And people in that room said some horrible things to me, called me a sinner, called me a freak, but they say worse things to these children. And they do it knowing that they're children, because they perceive them to be transgender. Whether they know that they're transgender or not, people who are anti-transgender do not care about insulting children. And I want you all to remember that when your basic instinct is to try to protect the children, because kids are the ones being affected here. Even if they're not the direct attack of the legislation, they're watching and they're learning and they're seeing who is safe to be around. And the cold, hard reality is some of our own community members aren't safe. And our trans kids are having to learn that the hard way.
Yeah, just to echo what James add up to this conversation, like, I think the toughest thing for me with like trans youth being involved is like, I wish I don't want them to have to be, right? Like, it's like if you want to do it, right? And that's kind of like my like MO with like any type of activist action, right? Is like the degree to which you want to do this rather than that you're obliged to do it. And I think that's something that, like James has said, that I've kind of struggled with, is like seeing like even with our own community members, like not necessarily providing like support to like trans youth, like when they want to participate, right? Or after they've already participated. And like for me, as like someone who's like accidentally stumbled into like some pretty bright spotlights before, and found myself in some dicey situations where some very cruel things were said, and some very clear threats were made. That's something that like my brain like always goes there of like, if we're like asking this of like trans youth, is it something, one, that they actually want to do? And two, is it something we are prepared to provide resources and safety for them before, during, and after? And I think that that is something that we really have to like consistently mention in this. And like, I don't know, this year at like TDOV, I saw like a lot more folks posting about like basically like the kind of insight was like, visibility without safety isn't good. And that was kind of the takeaway. And I think that's a really important thing for especially allies, both within the broader LGBTQ plus community and allies who aren't part of that community, to really remember.
Thank you, Ria and James. I think that, you know, it is so important. Like you said, safety is such an important part of the conversation that needs to be a reminder for folks who are in this fight, whether they're youth or adults. And emotional safety is a part of that safety as well. So, you know, for kids who are engaged in this, even if the kids are not testifying or not speaking in public, maybe they're writing testimony or supporting in another way, and making sure that kids are engaged with community and have friends in the queer community who they can talk to, who can resonate with their lived experiences during these really difficult times, is incredibly important for those who want to engage in this work. I think we are just about coming up on time. I want to thank the panelists so much for all of your expertise and vulnerability this evening. You had really wonderful questions and shared really beautiful stories, and I'm so thankful for your time and commitment towards trans justice. And thank you all for tuning in to make Ohio a safer place for our trans neighbors. We at the ACLU of Ohio are firmly committed to defending the rights of the TGNC community, and we will continue centering trans narratives in the fight for lived and equal equality. Thank you again.